The Woodhull Freedom Foundation does see itself as a human rights organization, as part of a human rights movement. Our human rights program has a threefold mission to it. One is to ensure that sexuality organizations and issues of sex and sexuality are integrated into the agenda of the domestic human rights movement. Secondly, that human rights is understood and used by organizations and communities that are advocating for sex and sexuality issues. And three, to advocate at the global, federal, state, and local level for sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. And some of the tangible ways in which we do that advocacy is around reforming sex offender registry laws. We're creating a continuing legal education program on sexuality as a fundamental human right. We are part of the Human Rights at Home campaign here in DC, which is working with the Obama administration to reinvigorate an interagency working group on human rights at the federal level, among various other objectives. And we do human rights education in all sorts of ways. So first, what do we mean when we say human rights? We, in this country, have started to hear the language of human rights over the past 10 to 15 years, more and more, especially. Hello? Yeah, I think that's, Ricky, is that on this end? I don't think that's on this end. It's some technical. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So, what's that? It's not on. You can hear it? Okay, sure. So, again, what do we mean by human rights? When we talk about human rights at Woodhull, we're talking about a people-centered vision, a people-centered movement for human rights, which the ultimate goal of which is social justice, including economic, racial, gender, and environmental justice. Human rights, thank you. A people-centered vision of human rights focuses on the rights of individuals, but also communities. It's not only focused on the individual, which is the way that some human rights work has been done traditionally, but we also understand that communities have rights as well. The human rights framework includes civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and emerging environmental and sexual and developmental rights. Human rights are all of ours because of one simple fact, that we were born human. Human rights recognize identity, but they raise the level of discourse and action to another level that transcends the differences among us. So they're not identity blind, but they look at our fundamental humanness as the reason for which we have these rights. Government and civil society must respect, protect, and promote our human rights. Human rights are inherent, inalienable, intersectional, and interdependent. These rights are codified in many ways. Within the UN system globally, they're codified in aspirational documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as many treaties and conventions, some of which the US is a party to and some of which we should be a party to but have refused to be, including the Convention Against Torture, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, of which only the United States and Somalia are not a party in the entire world, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In addition to the global UN system, we also have regional human rights systems. The US is a part of the Inter-American Human Rights System, and right here in DC, just a few blocks away, is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and a body that we really should be using much more, that is just waiting for US advocates to bring petitions and hearings around gender and sexuality issues, and we've failed to do that for the most part so far. The Inter-American system has the American Declaration on Human Rights, which the US has signed, and the American Convention on the Rights and Duties of Man, of which the US is not a party, mostly because of abortion and death penalty issues. Within the larger human rights framework, sexual rights is an emerging piece that activists, particularly from the global south, have raised at the grassroots level and brought to the UN level. Sexual rights are codified now within the Yogyakarta Principles, which is the set of guiding principles on international human rights law, sexuality, and gender. It takes from all of the treaties and all of the conventions and declarations and shows how sexuality and gender intersect and what rights we have in terms of sex and sexuality. Importantly, in terms of domestic law, our US Constitution is a human rights document, and we need to remember that. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution states that international treaties are the supreme law of the land, second only, well, equal to the Constitution. Whenever there is a conflict between state law or even jurisprudence and a treaty, the treaty is supposed to be supreme. That is rarely followed in this country, and yet it's plainly written in the Constitution that so all international human rights treaties should be treated and enforced at the federal, state, and local level. The second point I want to make is why should we use human rights and why now? Through framing, social movements define themselves, and we choose what language and what frameworks we do our work within. It's very important strategic decisions how and why we choose and use the frameworks that we do. Like I said, human rights recognize identity, they inherently recognize intersectionality and systems of oppression, but they raise discourse and action to a higher standard beyond identity politics, movement silos, and partisan politics, all of which have crippled progressive movements in this country for far too long. The Woodhull Freedom Foundation is not an issue or identity-based organization. We have a broad view of sexual freedom for all people, regardless of identity, location, or other factors. However, we understand that systems of oppression exist and that play out in the lives of different people in different ways. Human rights, importantly, include both positive rights and negative rights, which is something that makes them very different from domestic law. They insist that the government has a duty and obligation to respect, protect, and promote rights, and to address violations and inequality proactively rather than just retroactively, to ensure that systems are in place so that violations do not occur in the first place. I'm just going to give you an example of what I mean by that. A human rights approach obligates governments to both respect and ensure rights. This involves recognizing the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural dimensions of reproductive health, for example. And this is from Examining New Frameworks by Kathy Albiso. What this means in practice is that human rights standards not only obligate governments to not interfere with a woman's ability to make her own decisions with regard to her health, but also require governments to ensure that women are afforded the conditions to fully realize their right to the highest attainable standard of health. This translates into affordable, accessible, and quality health care for all women. The duty to ensure has not been fully embraced within the United States, and that is reflected in the deep inequities faced disproportionately by Latinas and others regarding access to health care. An example of what I mean by proactively addressing violations rather than simply retroactively or responsively comes from the New York City Human Rights Initiative, which is a grassroots effort of a very diverse group of community-based organizations in New York City that are trying to get the principles of CERD and CEDAW, the Women's Human Rights Convention and the Anti-Racism Convention, into local law. Within the New York City Human Rights Initiative, there's a legislative effort to pass the human rights goal, the Government Operations Audit Law. And within that, if that legislation were passed in New York City, problems in terms of human rights, particularly using an intersectional race and gender lens, would be addressed proactively rather than simply after the fact. Each city department, on a rotating basis, would conduct a human rights analysis to identify policies that may unintentionally discriminate against women, people of color, and other groups in the areas of employment practice, allocation of funding and human resources, and service delivery. After conducting these analyses, the departments then develop an action plan to correct in a timely manner inequities it has uncovered. Using the same criteria, prospective policies are screened before they are implemented. So this is using human rights standards and human rights data mechanisms to address problems before they occur, using, as I said, a lens that addresses systemic oppression, particularly with those most marginalized at the center. Another reason to use human rights now is because it is the framework that the rest of the world operates in. U.S. exceptionalism extends to this area as well, and I think that for too long, many U.S. activists have reflected that same kind of U.S. isolationism, and not engaging with the regional and global mechanisms that we are a part of, but for far too long have shunned. So it builds global solidarity to use a human rights framework. It challenges U.S. isolationism, and it connects the local to the global. Part of the human rights framework insists that those most directly impacted are always the experts. And we could see this in the way that human rights standards and mechanisms were used in terms of internally displaced persons on the Gulf Coast following Katrina, and in the rebuilding that's happened in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, where grassroots activists have really used human rights to their fullest extent. Those most directly impacted are the experts, and the right to participation, which is not a part of domestic law, is key in international human rights law. Meaning that if you've been directly impacted by a violation, you automatically and always have a seat at the table in terms of decision-making, how to redress and address that violation. The New York City Human Rights Initiative is another good example of that, where city personnel, community advocates, and city residents work together as allies rather than adversaries. A local human rights task force, which includes representatives of the community, city officials, and others with relevant knowledge and skills, assist in implementing the legislation. This kind of partnership not only generates more effective solutions, it can also help avoid costly lawsuits. And, as I said, ensure that those most directly impacted are speaking for themselves. Importantly, human rights includes the principle of progressive implementation. By progressive implementation, we mean that we have to take action with the maximum available resources and can never go backwards. So even though all the problems can't be fixed and human rights are aspirational, whenever there's a violation, it's the duty of the state to address that violation with its maximum available resources. And a principle we call minimum core content, that we can't fix everything, but there's a minimum below which we cannot go. There's a minimum standard for health, education, housing, et cetera, that we don't go below. Also, a reason is to reclaim this rich lost history of human rights freedom movements in the United States. One of the first, if not the first, queer organization in the United States in the 1920s in Chicago was the Society for Human Rights. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and W.B. Du Bois all understood the movements they were working in as human rights movements and understood the local global connection and implications of using a human rights framework. There's a long history as to why social movements in this country had narrowed into a civil rights framework, and there's a great book called Eyes Off the Prize by Carol Anderson that you all might be interested if you'd like to learn more about why it is that we've ignored economic, social, and cultural rights up to this point. Thankfully, advocates are now addressing economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights.